Mr. President. My colleagues on this side of the House have given a number of very passionate and very well-researched speeches about the flaws in this bill tonight. Like many others, I've received many emails and many stories of the trauma that people have faced over the years. Some of them are awful stories. They certainly are stories which make any of us feel upset at what we've seen. We've seen many of us, I think everyone in this place, have received emails from a 44-year-old male who told us that he'd only recently closed the door on a 40-year legal battle over his own abuse experiences as a 12-year-old. About a 61-year-old who didn't feel strong enough to claim victims' compensation until he was 57, for something which occurred when he was just 6, and that was a particularly awful story. From one of those community legal centres that so many people have spoken about, who talked about a domestic violence case where the person who'd been assaulted under the old Act would be able to get a maximum award of $38,000, but under the new scheme just $1,500. We've seen appalling cases which this government is going to restrict their ability to even claim in many of those cases because of the 10-year limit that we've heard so much about, or restrict the amount that they are able to get to limits which are simply unreasonable given the suffering. And we all know that the suffering that these people have encountered can't be cured by money, but the compensation process is part of a process for those people of coming to grips with and getting on with their lives. And it is a process which will be made harder by this government. This is a legislation which is about putting money before people, and so many of my colleagues have expressed that view. But it really is depressing to see the fact that in this debate, as the Honourable Helen Westwood and a number of other people have noted, that government members who, in opposition particularly, had so much to say on victims of crime, who had sent us all emails urging us to attend events in support of victims of crime or victims of crime groups, have been so silent on this legislation. Apart from the Minister in this debate, no government members have spoken. In the other place, where there are 70 government members, just three, and the Minister stood up to speak on this legislation. That is a sure sign that they are embarrassed about this, that they are unwilling to get up and defend it, and that they are simply going along with something that's being pushed through from them as a cost-saving measure. It's quite disgraceful, and we've seen from this side of the House the passion which this has aroused, because many of us on this side of the House just feel outraged by the way this government is handling victims' compensation. I have to say, one of the most offensive, one of the things which offended me the most this evening in this debate was unfortunately the contribution from the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile, where he had the temerity to get up here and suggest that members of the Labor Party were speaking on this with such passion because we had guilty consciences. Now, that was a disgraceful accusation to make from a person who I suspect might have been suffering from what he was accusing Labor of. But what are we guilty of? Are we guilty of erring on the side of generosity when it came to victims' compensation? Because the only thing which he actually criticised was his suggestion that costs in this scheme were blowing out. Now, I acknowledge that any scheme over time will always need to be looked at, but it needs to be looked with a balance of compassion and not just the money, as this government is doing. This government is addressing simply the money. And for the Reverend Fred Nile to suggest that this side of the House was getting up and talking on this with anything other than concern for the victims of crime in this state is offensive and devalues any other comment that he made. Now, I'll be interested to see the Honourable Reverend Fred Nile's amendments which he has foreshadowed are likely to be considered in this debate later on. I'll be interested to see what sort of deal he has done off his own bat having, as I understand it, refused to meet some of the groups who were so keen to talk to him about it. The interjection is they've met all the groups, they've spent hours with them, and I'll be interested to see whether that's borne out by comments that we get afterwards. So I'll be interested to see. What the deal that's been done is behind closed doors between the Reverend Nile. But for him to get up here and accuse the Labor Party of standing here with a guilty conscience is offensive in the extreme. And he should be embarrassed and ashamed of his effort. He is standing up here and backing the government in selling out the victims of crime. And in fact, if his only thing that he is suggesting Labor is guilty of, if anything, is guilty of erring on the side of generosity when it comes to the victims of crime, you should be embarrassed by your comments here tonight. And let's face it, if you go through a search on Hansard of the last Parliament when the government members were in opposition, the Honourable David Clark had plenty to say about victims of crime. He's been silent tonight. The Honourable Marie Ficarra had plenty to say about victims of crime, silent tonight. I've no doubt the Honourable Matthew Mason-Cox was the same. All sitting here. You didn't say the Honourable Matthew Mason-Cox interjects that he never said a thing about victims of crime in the last Parliament. I'll take him at his word on that because I didn't search for his name. But whilst I was sitting here and listening. But this is an example of government members who are sitting back here and allowing the motivation of simply saving money to overtake the motivation of assisting victims of crime with their legitimate needs. It is a disgrace for these members who now, with such hypocrisy, send us out emails urging us to support organisations and victims of crime, to sit here silently while the government imposes a 10-year limit. Silently while the government imposes a 10-year limit which would stop people like two of the examples I mentioned before, the people who've waited decades before they could face the task of going in and asking for retribution and to try and overcome the trauma to their lives which has been caused to them. It's a disgrace for those people in the government to sit silent and go along with simply a cost-cutting saving and see that 10-year clause put into this legislation, and also to see the overall amounts which people can get back in compensation. My colleagues have very eloquently outlined the case as to why this bill should be deferred tonight, and at the very least amended, but the preference would be to be deferred. Let's look at when this came in. It's been in this Parliament and the other place since the 7th of May. It is not a long time for the community to consider this sort of legislation. Yeah, the Minister might think that's a terribly long time for the community.
3 weeks plus the years of neglect by you guys.
The Minister says 3 weeks. 3 weeks the Minister thinks is plenty of time for the whole 8 million people in New South Wales to be aware of the length of time, to be aware of the time and this legislation, and discuss this legislation and consider the amendments being proposed. For the Minister to sit here at the table saying, "Oh, you're embarrassing," just shows the paucity of his argument. It is appalling that members opposite have been so silent on this. You are all hypocrites. I listened for 8 years in the other place to your colleagues and railing on about how they wanted more done for victims of crime. And in this place, you are all a party to removing the rights of those people, and you should be embarrassed.